My name is Claire Matthews, and the day my stepmother sold my father's house, I didn't just lose 4 walls and a roof. I watched her try to erase my entire bloodline. She thought she was clever, thought an invitation to the auction would humiliate me one last time, thought I'd sit quietly and watch strangers bid on the place where my mother's laughter still lived in the walls. But she had no idea what waited in the envelope inside my bag sealed by my father's lawyer before the day he died. When the auctioneer's hammer fell, she would scream, not because I fought her, but because I'd already won. The morning of the auction looked too beautiful for the kind of war I was walking into. The sky was polished blue, the kind my father used to call carpenter's light, bright enough to build under, gentle enough to see your mistakes. I parked 3 blocks away, hands trembling on the steering wheel, staring at the house's roofline rising above the oak trees. That house had seen everything. My mother's illness, my father's recovery, birthdays, funerals, blueprints taped to the dining table, me learning to saw straight lines in the garage at 12. And now, because Lydia couldn't stand the sight of anything that reminded her she hadn't built it, she was selling it off like a used car. I checked the wooden box on the seat beside me, the one my father had carved himself smooth walnut with our initials branded underneath. Inside lay his final card, the proof that patience and foresight can outlast greed. I had promised him standing by his hospital bed that I would protect what he built. I just never imagined that promise would lead me to a public auction facing a woman who had spent 10 years turning his memory into currency. Lydia Matthews was the kind of woman who could charm a priest while stealing the collection plate. At 58, she had the elegance of a woman who knew how to weaponize good posture. Her voice was honey dipped in vinegar. I used to think she loved my father. Maybe she did in the same way a thief loves the lock they're about to pick. When Dad died of a heart attack 2 years ago, she turned grief into performance art, black veil, trembling hands, crocodile tears for the cameras. I stood in the second pew, feeling like an uninvited guest at my own father's funeral. 2 weeks later, she told me with her lawyer's letterhead in hand that my father had left everything to her. The house, the savings the company shares. He wanted you to build your own future, Claire. She'd said, her lips curling around the word own like it tasted bitter. She didn't know that my father had already built my future quietly in documents she hadn't found. When her invitation arrived last week, embossed with her new husband's real estate logo, I almost laughed. "Come watch history change hands," it said. It wasn't a gesture of closure, it was a challenge. Lydia had always underestimated me, the quiet daughter who chose architecture over arguments. She thought silence meant surrender, but silence in my family meant measurement waiting until the foundation was solid enough to bear the truth. I walked toward the auction house, heels clicking on the marble floor, every sound measured like a countdown. The foyer smelled of polished wood and money. People murmured in clusters, eyes darting toward me as whispers spread. "That's Thomas's daughter. Didn't she lose the house? Why would she come?" I kept my chin high, my steps even. The auctioneer nodded politely. Lydia turned, saw me, and her smile tightened like a noose. "Claire." She cooed, "How thoughtful of you to attend. Closure is important." I looked past her at the framed photograph of the house displayed on the easel, the caption beneath reading Historic Matthews Residence. My father's life reduced to a marketing bullet point. I met her eyes and said softly, "Closure is exactly why I'm here." She laughed low and satisfied like she'd already won. But I could see the faint flicker of worry when I placed the walnut box on my lap and rested my hand over it. She didn't know that inside were documents that would turn her auction into an arrest. People talk about revenge like it's fire, something that burns quick and bright. They forget that justice can be colder, that sometimes it waits patient as paper in a drawer until the right hand opens it. My father taught me that patience is the loudest form of power, and today, in this bright morning that smelled of sawdust and betrayal, I was about to prove him right. The auction room was colder than I expected, or maybe it was the way people's eyes chilled the air. I took a seat 3 rows from the front, where the sunlight hit the mahogany floor and cast long stripes across my shoes. Each sound in that room had purpose. The low hum of whispers, the shuffle of papers, the polite laughter of investors who had no idea they were about to witness a reckoning. Lydia stood near the podium, radiant in her performance, wearing black silk and pearls like grief was a fashion statement. She spotted me, and her smile tightened as if she'd tasted lemon. "Claire, darling, I didn't think you'd come," she said, voice syrupy, reaching for the illusion of kindness. "It's only a house. I thought it might help you move on." I met her eyes and said evenly, "It's never just a house, Lydia. Not when it holds a man's legacy." Her smile faltered for half a heartbeat before she turned to greet another guest. I looked around and saw faces I didn't recognize. Real estate agents, developers, opportunists. To them, this was another acquisition, a chance to buy a piece of history and flip it for profit. To me, it was the last thread connecting me to my father's promises. Mr. Harlan Cooper. My father's attorney nodded at me from the side of the room. He carried a briefcase that looked too ordinary for what it held. Inside were the documents my father had left, sealed proof that Lydia's power had an expiration date. As the auctioneer arranged his notes, I thought back to the last night I saw my father alive. He had been in his study, the air thick with the smell of cedar and old paper. "You can't build a future on someone else's foundation," he told me while sliding a wooden box across the desk. "Patience is stronger than anger, Claire. Someday you'll understand why." I didn't then. I was 27, frustrated, tired of watching Lydia control every decision. Now, sitting in that room surrounded by strangers, I finally understood. He hadn't been teaching me how to fight her. He'd been teaching me how to outlast her. The auctioneer tapped the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the sale of the historic Matthews residence built in 1914 and lovingly maintained by the late Thomas Matthews." The words hit me like glass. Lovingly maintained until she drained its warmth and called it hers. Lydia stood beside the display photo of the house smiling like she'd painted it herself. Her new stepson Gregory hovered close, adjusting his cufflinks, eyes darting toward me with smug amusement. He thought I was harmless, just another sentimental daughter. The bidding started at $900,000. 2 developers raised their paddles. Lydia clapped her hands lightly, feigning surprise. "Oh, how exciting," she whispered to the man beside her. My heart pounded, but my expression didn't change. I watched the numbers climb my fingers, tracing the edge of the wooden box in my lap. I could almost hear my father's voice saying, "Let them build their own downfall." When the bid reached $1.7 million, the room hushed. Lydia glanced at me, certain I couldn't possibly match these men. That was when I lifted my paddle. The click of the wooden handle echoed. $2 million, I said, clear and calm. Heads turned. Lydia's smile evaporated. "Excuse me," the auctioneer asked. $2 million, I repeated. Cashier's check confirmed. Gasps fluttered through the room like startled birds. Lydia's mask cracked. "She's bluffing," she snapped, her composure fraying. "She doesn't have that kind of money." The auctioneer hesitated. "Ma'am, is your bid valid?" I reached into my bag and placed a sealed envelope on the table in front of me. "It's valid," I said quietly, "and it comes with conditions." Harlan rose from his chair, his voice calm but authoritative. "I represent Miss Matthews and the estate of Thomas Matthews. Before this sale proceeds, there is something you all need to hear." The crowd shifted, whispers spreading faster now. Lydia turned toward me, eyes sharp as glass. "What are you doing, Claire?" she demanded, voice trembling with fury. I stood the wooden box in my hands, the symbol of every promise my father ever kept. Finishing what he started, I said. And in that moment, even before a single document was read, the balance in that room shifted. She just didn't know it yet. I was 10 when my father first showed me how to sand a plank of wood until it felt like silk. He said a craftsman doesn't fight the grain. He learns to move with it even when it splinters. That lesson had shaped every part of my life, though I didn't know it back then. When my mother died of ovarian cancer, Dad poured his grief into rebuilding the house. Every beam, every floorboard became a memorial to her patience. And for a while it worked. The house breathed again. Then Lydia appeared. She came into our lives like a soft breeze that turned into a storm before we noticed the sky had changed. Dad met her at a charity fundraiser. She was all warmth and polished laughter, the kind of woman who never forgot to compliment someone's tie while memorizing their bank balance. Within 6 months, she'd turned Sunday dinners into auditions for affection. I wanted to like her. She made Dad smile again, and he deserved that. But there were moments, quick flashes, when her eyes cooled the room. The first time she hugged me, she whispered, "You poor thing, you must miss having a mother." And I remember thinking she wasn't comforting me. She was claiming a vacancy. By the time I left for college, the house felt less like home and more like a stage where Lydia played both victim and star. I'd come back for holidays to find furniture moved, family photos replaced with her portraits, even my mother's piano sold to make space. Whenever I asked, she smiled like I was a child catching her in a harmless prank. "Change is healthy, darling," she'd say. Dad, caught between guilt and exhaustion, avoided conflict. "She means well, Claire. Let's not start another argument." So I learned silence. I thought it was peace, but it was only surrender wrapped in politeness. When I graduated with the degree in architecture, Dad couldn't have been prouder. He brought me to the study, handed me an envelope, and said, "This house will always be yours, no matter what paper says otherwise." Lydia had walked in at that exact moment, her perfume cutting through the air like warning smoke. "Thomas, don't fill her head with promises. She's got her own life now." He smiled, gentle but firm. "Yes, and she deserves to know where she came from." That night, I overheard them arguing through the walls. She wanted to sell the old lumber business, move to California, invest in something modern. He refused. "You marry into history, Lydia," he said. "You don't rewrite it." The next morning, the locks on my childhood bedroom were changed. I told myself it was coincidence. I was 23 and still pretending this woman hadn't already redrawn every line in our family portrait. 2 years later, Dad had a mild heart attack. Lydia called me 2 days after he was hospitalized. "He's stable," she said, "but visits would only stress him. He needs calm, not chaos." I flew home anyway. The nurse at the desk told me he'd been asking for me. When I entered his room, Lydia was there rearranging flowers by the window. Her eyes narrowed. "5 minutes, Claire. He needs rest." Dad smiled weakly and whispered, "Promise me you'll keep the house safe." I promised. It was the last thing I ever said to him. He died 3 days later, and Lydia didn't call until after the funeral arrangements were made. At the service, she performed grief like an opera, tears, trembling hands, the whole act. She spoke about our family, about shared dreams, never once mentioning the daughter standing at the back of the church because Lydia had told the usher the front row was family only. That was when something inside me hardened. I realized she wasn't protecting Dad's peace. She was burying his truth under her performance. Now sitting in the auction hall, I could still hear her voice from that day, syrupy and false. "You should move on, Claire." She'd said it like moving on meant forgetting everything that ever mattered, but my father's voice was louder in my memory, steady and kind. "Patience, sweetheart. Let time do the building." I looked at the walnut box and thought, time's up. Lydia Matthews had always been the kind of woman who mistook control for care. After my father's death, she turned that house into a mausoleum she could manage, hosting charity teas and business dinners that felt more like auditions for future investors. She loved the performance of refinement, but under every polite smile was calculation. I saw it each time she told the story of how she and my father had met, embellishing his devotion until she seemed like the one who had rescued him from loneliness. She never mentioned my mother, not once. That was the first ghost she erased. The second was me. When I tried to stay in the house after the funeral, Lydia made it unbearable. She'd leave my father's shirts boxed up on the curb for donation, then look surprised when I brought them back inside. He wouldn't want clutter, she'd say. She started moving my things into the guest room, then into storage. "You need a fresh start," she insisted. The last night I lived there, she came to my door holding a glass of wine, pretending to be kind. "Claire, you're so talented. You could do so much better somewhere new. Seattle's full of opportunities." Her eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of someone kicking a bird from its nest. I moved out the next morning. For a while, distance felt like survival. I focused on work, joined a small architecture firm, and learned to live with the ache of being displaced. But Lydia didn't stop. She sold the lumber mill my grandfather had built, converted my father's workshop into a wine cellar, and sent me polite emails about property updates. It was psychological warfare disguised as etiquette. When I protested, she said, "Your father trusted me with everything. You should too." And that was her favorite lie-wrapping betrayal in the language of trust. Dad's lawyer, Mr. Harlan Cooper, kept in touch. He'd been a family friend for decades, a man of few words, and too much integrity for Lydia's liking. About 6 months after the funeral, he asked me to lunch. Your father left something sealed, he said. He wanted it opened 1 year after his death in your presence. I asked if Lydia knew. He smiled thinly. She knows there's a will. She doesn't know which one counts. That sentence sat in my mind like a ticking clock. Meanwhile, Lydia's empire started to wobble. Gregory, her son from her first marriage, had always been the shadow behind her ambition. He managed her investments, most of them risky. Word reached me through acquaintances that Gregory had racked up debt from failed startups and a gambling habit. Lydia kept covering it up, selling properties quietly, including one cabin Dad had left in the mountains for retirement. Every sale brought her closer to liquidating the house, but she needed one more thing: public legitimacy. That's when she decided to auction the home. It wasn't just greed, it was ego. She wanted applause for letting go of her burden. When her invitation arrived with embossed lettering, I could feel her arrogance in every loop of ink. I thought you'd like to witness closure, it read. After all, we both loved this house. Closure wasn't what she wanted. She wanted an audience. She wanted me to sit among strangers while she auctioned off my father's promises, pretending to be the benevolent widow freeing herself from memories. But Dad had left more than memories. He'd left a morality clause buried in his estate. If the property was sold within a year of his death, all rights reverted to his heir. Lydia, blinded by vanity, hadn't noticed. And Gregory, drowning in his own mess, had forged my father's signature on a loan that would tie them both to fraud. All of it sat quietly in Harlan's files, waiting. The night before the auction, I visited the house. The porch light flickered like it recognized me. I ran my hand over the old oak door, the grain smooth where Dad's hand had polished it 1,000 times. You built this to last, I whispered. I'll make sure it does. For the first time in years, I felt calm, not the numb kind of calm that follows loss, but the steady kind that comes before justice. The morning after my father's funeral, Lydia had summoned me to her study. It used to be my father's, filled with sketches of houses he'd designed and the scent of sawdust that clung to him like a second skin. Now it smelled like perfume and control. She sat behind his desk, hands folded over a crisp envelope bearing the lawyer's seal. Your father wanted things to be simple, she said sweetly, sliding the paper toward me. He left everything in my care. You're young. You have your career. He trusted me to make sure you're looked after. Her words dripped with practiced sympathy, but her eyes told the truth. There was satisfaction there, a quiet triumph. I opened the envelope, half expecting to see my name, half knowing I wouldn't. The document was brief and brutally clear. The estate, the house, the savings, everything passed to Lydia Matthews. There wasn't a single mention of me. My pulse roared in my ears, but I stayed still. You know this isn't right, I said quietly. Lydia leaned back, feigning patience. Your father revised his will 2 months before he died. He said you didn't need burdening with maintenance and taxes. He wanted you free, Claire. She smiled as if she'd done me a favor. Freedom from responsibility. Isn't that what young people want these days? I left before I said something I couldn't take back. For weeks I tried to believe her. Maybe Dad had changed his mind. Maybe he thought Lydia would protect what he'd built. But the thought soured each time I remembered his promise. The house will always be yours. My father was many things, stubborn, practical, sometimes secretive, but never careless. He wouldn't have left me with nothing. When I finally called Harlan, his sigh said more than his words. I can't discuss the contents of the sealed file, Claire, he said. But I can tell you this, your father anticipated deception. He was deliberate about timing. A year is a long wait, I know, but patience is your inheritance. I asked if Lydia could destroy what he'd left. He chuckled dryly. Not unless she finds it, and she won't. He placed copies in trust with the board of his company. She only has what he let her see. That conversation changed everything. I started noticing patterns, the small inconsistencies in Lydia's stories. She'd claimed Dad wanted to sell the house, yet the property taxes were prepaid for 2 years. She'd say he was too ill to review business paperwork, yet his last emails to me detailed his next project. When I checked with the county registry, I discovered a pending note attached to the deed, a clause marked inactive until probate completion. Lydia hadn't even noticed. That was my father's handwriting in bureaucratic disguise. 6 months later, Harlan invited me to meet at his office downtown. He looked older, the weight of silence heavy on his shoulders. "I'll tell you what I can," he said, locking the door. "Your father left 2 wills. The one Lydia filed was a decoy. The real one is sealed under a conditional trust that activates exactly 12 months after his death. It includes something called a conditional deed transfer. If she sells the house before that date, it reverts automatically to you." My heart stuttered. "You're serious?" He nodded. "Deadly serious. And if she forges anything to override it, that's felony fraud." For the first time in months, I laughed a sharp, broken sound that surprised us both. "He really planned for her," I said. Harlan smiled faintly. "Thomas Matthews didn't build weak structures. He just trusted people too long." That night I couldn't sleep. The thought of Lydia sitting in that same study, smug and sure she'd won, made my chest ache with both anger and admiration for my father's foresight. He'd seen her coming. He'd seen me too quiet, too cautious, but capable of patience. When Lydia's embossed invitation arrived 6 months later, it wasn't a shock. It was prophecy fulfilling itself. "Come watch history change hands," it said. She had no idea it already had. The air inside the auction hall had the weight of anticipation, the kind that hangs before a storm. People milled about with champagne flutes and catalog booklets, laughing as if they weren't about to dissect someone's history into saleable parts. The house's photo glowed on a massive screen at the front Lot 12, the Matthews estate, a rare architectural gem. I wanted to vomit. My father's dream was now a lot number. Lydia, radiant as ever in her black silk dress, worked the crowd like a politician, her laughter echoing across the marble floor. Gregory stood beside her in a tailored suit, scrolling through his phone, looking restless and bored. He'd always been her shadow charming, when convenient, cruel when unobserved. When I arrived, their attention faltered. Lydia's expression flickered the briefest flash of annoyance before she fixed her smile back in place. "Claire, sweetheart," she said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "I didn't think you'd come." "I'm touched." She leaned in for a kiss on the cheek that never landed. I stepped back. I couldn't miss the moment my father's home became a spectacle. I replied evenly. Gasps murmured through the crowd, but Lydia only chuckled. "You always had your mother's dramatics," she said, voice syrupy. "Try to enjoy the day. It's about legacy." Legacy! The word made my jaw tighten. The auctioneer tapped the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are honored to present the Matthews residence built in 1914, restored in 1988, and lovingly maintained by the late Thomas Matthews." He said it all with professional detachment, the way one might read an obituary for a stranger. Lydia clasped her hands together, nodding with feigned modesty. "My late husband cherished this house," she said, projecting her voice toward the guests. "But I believe in moving forward. Let another family write their story here." My fingers curled around the handle of the walnut box in my lap. She didn't believe in moving forward, she believed in erasing. The first bid came from a real estate developer in the front row. 900,000, he called out. Then another voice, 1.1. The numbers climbed like a fever. 1.4. 1.7. Lydia's eyes gleamed. She glanced toward Gregory, who nodded, signaling that her plan was working. The higher the bids went, the more legitimate she looked. A widow selling her late husband's home for the sake of closure. A performance of respectability so smooth it would have fooled anyone except the man who'd built the house and the daughter who carried his patience in her bones. Then the room quieted. 1.9 said a soft voice from the back. Heads turned. Lydia's smile faltered when she saw me raise my paddle. 2 million, I said clearly. The words seemed to ripple through the room. Cameras flashed, phones lifted. Lydia's voice rose above the murmurs, brittle and sharp. "She's bluffing. This is absurd. She doesn't have that kind of money." The auctioneer looked uncertain. "Ma'am, can you confirm the bid?" Before I could respond, Harlan stood. "Yes," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "The funds are verified. And before this sale proceeds, there are documents that must be acknowledged, documents pertaining to the estate's ownership and legality." Silence fell like a curtain. Lydia's hand flew to her pearls. "This is nonsense. There's no documentation. Harlan opened his briefcase with deliberate care, pulling out a sealed envelope. Mrs. Matthews, the law disagrees. Your late husband filed a conditional deed transfer under my supervision. Lydia's face drained of color. That's impossible, she hissed. I had everything reviewed. Not everything, Harlan said quietly. He handed the papers to the auctioneer, who blinked, uncertain whether to read them aloud. Perhaps we should pause the proceedings, he suggested, voice trembling slightly. But I stood. No, I said calmly. Let her hear it. The auctioneer cleared his throat and began to read. Under Clause 4B of the Matthews Trust, should the estate be sold or transferred within 12 months of the death of Thomas Matthews, all ownership reverts to the named heir, Miss Claire Matthews. The sound that came from Lydia wasn't human. It was half gasp, half snarl. You forged this, she spat, stepping forward. You're trying to steal from me. I met her eyes and said evenly, You can't steal what's already yours. Her hand trembled as she turned toward Harlan. You'll pay for this. No, he said, sliding another paper onto the table. You will. Lydia's voice cracked through the silence like glass shattering. This is outrageous. That clause is invalid. I have the certified will. Her confidence wavered, though a tremor of uncertainty beneath the fury. She turned toward the crowd as if summoning allies from the audience the way she always had. My husband trusted me. Everyone here knows that. But the crowd was shifting, whispers spreading, fast curiosity overtaking sympathy. Harlan stayed calm, his tone precise and steady. Mrs. Matthews, the certified will you filed is not the final document. The true estate records were filed with the court under sealed trust conditions to be revealed 1 year after Mr. Matthews's death today, in fact. He held up the stamped envelope, the seal still unbroken. This document was notarized and stored independently with the county clerk's office. I have the confirmation receipt right here. The auctioneer blinked clearly, regretting agreeing to this event. I think we need legal verification before proceeding. Lydia stepped forward, her polished composure crumbling. He was confused near the end. He didn't know what he was signing. Her voice trembled now, the first real crack in her performance. Harlan raised an eyebrow. Then, how do you explain his signature matching the original corporate filings, the ones you and your son tried to alter? Gregory shifted uneasily beside her. Mom, he muttered, tugging her sleeve. Let's just leave. We can sort this out later. But Lydia wasn't listening. She was unraveling, realizing that the power she'd spent years building was slipping through her fingers in front of everyone. This isn't over, she snapped, turning toward me. You think you've won, Claire? That house was my life. I made it beautiful again after your mother left it to rot. The words hit me like a slap. I took a deep breath. My mother didn't leave it to rot, I said quietly, every word deliberate. She died in that house, Lydia, and you erased her memory before the floors were even dry. The air in the room tightened. Even the bidders seemed to hold their breath. I turned to the auctioneer. Would you please continue reading? He nodded nervously and unfolded the rest of the document. In addition, all financial accounts tied to the Matthews estate, including the late Mr. Matthews' business holdings, are to be reviewed by the trust executor upon his wife's remarriage or any sale attempt of primary residence. His voice quavered as he reached the final line. Should evidence of fraud, forgery, or undue influence be found, all rights transfer permanently to his daughter Claire Matthews. Lydia's knees buckled. Gregory caught her arm, but his face had gone pale. Harlan's assistant approached the front with a separate folder. Your father was very thorough, Miss Matthews Harlan said, handing it to me. He left a full accounting of his business transactions along with evidence of forgery attempts on multiple loan documents signed under his name after his death. We traced the IP address back to Gregory's laptop. The room erupted. Gasps, camera shutters, murmurs growing into waves. Lydia turned on her son, eyes wide with disbelief. You told me everything was handled, she hissed. You said no one could trace it. Gregory stammered. They must have found the backup server, Mom. His voice broke off as realization set in. He'd confessed in front of everyone. Harlan raised a hand. For everyone's clarity, those documents have already been submitted to the district attorney's office. This isn't just an inheritance dispute, it's an active fraud investigation. The crowd buzzed louder now, half horrified, half fascinated. The auctioneer stepped back from the podium as if afraid of being complicit. Lydia tried to speak, but her voice was gone. Her hands shook as she clutched at her pearls like they could save her from drowning. "You think you're better than me?" she finally whispered. "You think this makes you pure. But everything your father built, he built because I pushed him. I made him dream again. Without me, he would have died alone." I looked at her, the woman who had spent years convincing herself that cruelty was devotion. "You're right," I said softly. "You did make him dream again, but he woke up before he died, and that's why we're here." And for the first time in all the years I'd known her, Lydia Matthews had no reply. For a long, heavy moment, no one in that auction hall moved. The silence wasn't peace, it was impact, like the air itself was waiting to see who would fall first. Lydia's painted smile had vanished, replaced by something raw and unfamiliar fear. Her son, Gregory, stood rigid beside her, jaw tight, the arrogance gone from his posture. He looked suddenly very young, very small, like a boy caught playing with matches in a burning house. I stepped closer to them, not out of cruelty, but clarity. "You sold the only home my father ever loved," I said evenly. "You turned it into a trophy for your ego. And for what?" Another lie, another headline, another mask. Lydia's lips trembled, but she forced a bitter smile. "You think this is justice," she whispered. "You think parading your family's private affairs in front of strangers makes you righteous. Your father would be ashamed of this." Harlan's voice cut through hers like steel. "Thomas Matthews was ashamed of many things before he died, Mrs. Matthews, but none of them were his daughter." He lifted another document, its seal gleaming under the chandeliers. "This is a certified addendum to the trust written by your husband 4 days after his final hospital stay. It states that any individual proven to have tampered with estate assets or coerced the trustee shall be removed from all claims and subject to legal investigation." Lydia's hand shot out trying to snatch the paper, but Harlan stepped back. "Touch this document and you'll add obstruction of justice to your list of charges," he warned calmly. Her hand froze midair. She was shaking now, not from rage, but realization. Gregory tried to recover some authority. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "You can't just accuse people of crimes in public." But his voice lacked conviction. Harlan didn't flinch. "The evidence will speak for itself. The bank logs show your login credentials were used to transfer company funds to offshore accounts. The security footage from the office building confirms you were there the night after Mr. Matthews passed away. I've already forwarded everything to the authorities." A murmur swept through the crowd. Phones lifted. Someone whispered, "This is going viral." Lydia turned desperate looking for allies, but found only faces pretending not to know her. The donors, the business partners, the investors, all had built their reputations on proximity to her wealth. Now that wealth was smoke. "Enough!" Lydia shouted, her voice cracking under its own weight. "You don't know what it was like. I took care of that man while you chased your career. I kept the business alive when he was too weak to sign checks. I deserved something for that." Her words echoed brittle and hollow. I met her eyes. "You deserved gratitude, maybe. But gratitude isn't ownership. You don't get to erase a man's bloodline because you filed paperwork." I stepped closer, my voice low enough for only her to hear. "You didn't marry into a dynasty, Lydia. You married into a family, and you destroyed it." For a flicker of a second, something human flashed in her expression. Regret, maybe. Then it was gone, replaced by venom. "You think the world will celebrate you for this?" she spat. "They'll call you ungrateful, cruel, vindictive, just like your mother." I smiled faintly. My mother never sold her soul for attention. Maybe that's why you hate her. Harlan cleared his throat, stepping between us. "Mrs. Matthews," he said firmly, "you are hereby notified that the sale of the Matthews residence is null and void. As executor of the estate, I am reclaiming the property under Clause 4B until legal review is complete. You are also advised not to leave the state until the fraud investigation concludes." Gasps rippled through the room. Lydia's face drained of color. Gregory muttered a curse under his breath. "You can't—" "We can," Harlan interrupted, "and we will." And security guards, discreet but efficient, moved closer. The auctioneer wiped sweat from his brow. I looked at Lydia one last time. "You wanted an audience," I said softly. "Now you have one." Her breath hitched. "You'll regret this," she whispered. "No," I replied. "I'll rebuild." And with that, I turned away from her the same way my father once had when he realized you can't negotiate with greed. Behind me, I heard Lydia's voice crack into a scream as the officers approached. It wasn't victory I felt. It was relief. When I stepped out of the auction hall, the sunlight hit me like a confession. The chaos behind me, the voices, the cameras, the desperate murmurs faded into the hum of the street. I should have felt triumphant, but triumph wasn't what this was. It was just as slow and cold, like stone settling after an earthquake. For years, Lydia had owned every room she walked into. For the first time, she owned nothing, not the house, not the story, not even her reputation. As I reached the parking lot, I heard footsteps. "Gregory!" He jogged after me, his tie loosened, his composure gone. "Claire, wait," he called out. I turned, arms folded. "You have 5 seconds before I keep walking." His voice cracked. "I didn't know she forged anything. I thought your dad's lawyers had signed off. He was lying. The kind of lie you tell when you've been caught and can't remember where the truth even starts." "You used my father's name to take loans," I said. "You funneled money through the company to pay your gambling debts." "You think I don't know?" He flinched like I'd hit him. "It wasn't supposed to go this far," he muttered. "Mom said she'd fix it." I looked at him for a long moment and saw what my father must have seen years ago. A boy raised on shortcuts believing manipulation was survival. "She can't fix it anymore," I said quietly. "And neither can you." His jaw trembled. "You could drop the charges. You've won. What's the point?" "The point," I said, "is accountability. Something your family never learned." I walked away. Behind me, his voice broke into a single defeated whisper. "We were just trying to survive." When I reached my car, Harlan was waiting by the door, briefcase in hand, face calm as ever. "It's done," he said simply. "The county clerk has confirmed your father's trust activation. You'll receive full ownership of the property within 48 hours. I nodded, my throat tight. "And Lydia," he exhaled slowly. "The DA's office already has the evidence. Given the forgery and fraud, she'll likely face charges. Gregory, too. It's not pleasant business, but your father made sure there'd be consequences." I didn't answer. We stood there in silence for a while, the hum of distant traffic filling the space. Then Harlan said softly, "He'd be proud of you, you know. You didn't destroy her, you let her destroy herself." That night, the news broke. Socialite Lydia Matthews under investigation for estate fraud. My phone exploded with messages, reporters, colleagues, even distant relatives who'd once ignored me. The footage from the auction was already online. Someone had recorded the entire confrontation. The video hit 1 million views in less than 12 hours. Comment sections lit up with words like karma and justice served. I stayed off social media, but the emails kept coming. Old family friends apologized for believing Lydia's version of events. Former clients of my father's firm reached out offering support. One message stood out from an older woman named Mrs. Hall, who'd worked as our housekeeper when I was a child. She wrote, "Your father always said, 'Truth takes time, Miss Claire.' I'm glad to see it arrived right on schedule." 2 days later, the county transferred the deed back into my name. When I drove up the old gravel driveway, the gates swung open with a familiar creak. The house looked tired but unbroken, like it had been waiting for someone to come home. I stood in the foyer, running my hand along the wall where Dad had once hung our family photos. The sunlight filtered through the stained glass window, scattering colors across the floor, just like it used to when I was little. For the first time in years, it didn't feel haunted. It felt alive. I whispered, "We made it, Dad." And in that still, quiet air, it almost felt like he answered. By the following week, the headlines had shifted from gossip to indictment. Former widow charged in estate fraud scheme. Socialite son implicated in forgery investigation. News anchors spoke their names with the kind of careful disgust reserved for fallen idols. Watching it unfold didn't bring me joy exactly, it brought balance. For the first time, truth had weight again. Harlan called me early Monday morning. His tone was steady, but I could hear the quiet satisfaction beneath it. The district attorney's office moved faster than expected, he said. They executed search warrants over the weekend. Lydia's accounts have been frozen. Gregory's assets, too. There were offshore transfers traced to both. "Is she in custody?" I asked. "House arrest for now," he replied. But that won't last. The evidence trail is clear. The forged signatures, the altered documents, even video surveillance of Gregory accessing your father's files after hours. It's airtight. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the sunlight spilling across my coffee mug. My father planned all of this, I murmured. Even from his deathbed, he made sure she couldn't win. He trusted the law, Claire Harlan said, and he trusted you to use it wisely. Later that day, I went downtown for the preliminary hearing. Lydia arrived flanked by 2 attorneys, her wrists bare but her composure fractured. She still wore pearls, always pearls, but her hair had lost its sheen. Gregory followed behind her, pale and defeated, avoiding eye contact. The courthouse buzzed with reporters, their microphones ready to capture every twitch of emotion. When Lydia saw me sitting in the second row, her face hardened. She tried to smile, but the mask cracked before it reached her eyes. During the hearing, the prosecutor laid out the evidence: falsified loan documents, misappropriated funds from the Matthews Company, forged signatures on property transfers. When they played the security footage, Gregory sneaking into the office at 2:17 a.m., the courtroom murmured like a hive disturbed. The judge's gavel brought silence. Mrs. Matthews, he said, the evidence presented suggests deliberate fraud and misuse of fiduciary power. You are formally charged with 2 counts of financial forgery, 1 count of estate tampering, and 1 count of conspiracy to defraud. Lydia's lawyer objected, stammering about emotional distress, about misunderstanding, about confusion in the months after her husband's death. But her own voice betrayed her when she stood. "That house was my life," she said, trembling. "I gave everything for that family. That man Thomas, he owed me more than gratitude." The prosecutor's reply was ice cold. "And you thought that debt included his daughter's inheritance." Her silence was admission enough. When the judge set bail, it was higher than I'd expected. Gregory's was lower, but he couldn't meet it. They were both taken into custody pending trial. As Lydia passed me on her way out, she paused for a fraction of a second. "You think this fixes everything," she whispered, "but you'll end up alone just like your father." I met her gaze. "No," I said. "I'll end up at peace." She didn't look back. Outside the courthouse, the autumn air felt sharp and clean, like the world had been rinsed of something stale. Reporters shouted questions as I walked to the steps. "Miss Matthews, do you have a statement?" one called. I stopped, looked directly into the cameras, and said, "My father taught me that justice doesn't need vengeance, it needs patience. Today proves he was right." Then I walked away. That night, I sat in my father's study, my study now. The desk still bore faint scratches where he'd carved measurements. The walnut box sat open beside a framed photo of us taken the year before he met Lydia. I unfolded the last letter Harlan had given me, written in my father's firm, deliberate handwriting. "My dear Claire, if you're reading this, you've learned what patience can build. I couldn't protect you from betrayal, but I could give you the tools to outlast it. Let the law do its work. Let time strip the false from the true. And when it's over, don't let bitterness own you. Rebuild. That's what you were born to do." I folded the letter, tears blurring the ink. "I will, Dad," I whispered. "I promise." 3 months passed before the trial began, but the story had already cemented itself in public memory. The internet had crowned it the widow's auction. News outlets ran features about justice through documentation. I avoided most of it, preferring the quiet hum of rebuilding. Anderson and Matthews Designs, my father's old firm, was reborn under my full name. I refused to let the scandal define my legacy. Instead, I turned it into momentum. Clients admired the discipline. Investors admired the resilience. By the time the first snow fell, the company was solvent again, growing, thriving. But the trial drew me back into the past. When I walked into the courtroom that first day, Lydia sat at the defense table, a shell of the woman who had once orchestrated dinner parties like stage plays. Her hair was gray at the edges, her posture stooped. Gregory sat beside her, staring at the floor. They looked less like conspirators now, more like casualties of their own greed. The prosecutor's case was straightforward: forged signatures, falsified documents, and a trail of digital footprints leading straight to Lydia's and Gregory's accounts. Harlan testified first, methodical and unflinching. Thomas Matthews anticipated this exact fraud, he said, holding up the sealed trust. He created a conditional clause to protect his daughter's inheritance and the integrity of his company. Everything the defendants attempted to manipulate was already secured under law. Lydia's attorney tried to spin it into emotion. Mrs. Matthews acted out of confusion and grief, he pleaded. She was a widow managing complex business affairs misled by her son's mistakes. But then the prosecution presented the emails, Lydia's emails, where she bragged about cleaning up the paperwork before that girl finds out. Her voice, preserved in black and white, stripped away every illusion. When it was my turn to testify, I didn't look at Lydia. I spoke to the jury instead. My father taught me that integrity isn't inherited, it's practiced. He believed in patience and structure in giving people enough time to reveal who they really are. Lydia and Gregory did exactly that. I paused, then added, "This isn't revenge. It's restoration. He built something honest, and I'm just making sure it stays that way." When I stepped down, I finally looked at her. She didn't meet my eyes. After 3 days of testimony, the verdict came swiftly guilty on all counts. Lydia was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison for fraud and forgery, Gregory to 2 for aiding and abetting. The judge's final words still echo in my mind. Greed may purchase silence for a season, but truth, when documented, is forever. When the gavel fell, I didn't celebrate. I felt released. The chain that had kept my father's legacy hostage was finally broken. Outside, reporters clustered, but I slipped out through the side exit. Snow had started falling in soft, wet flakes, quieting the world around me. That night, I drove back to the house. I stood on the front porch, breathing in the winter air. The walls no longer felt heavy. They felt watchful, alive again. Inside, I lit the fireplace and unpacked a small box I'd kept sealed since my father's funeral. Inside were photos me at 10, with sawdust in my hair, him laughing over blueprints, Mom playing piano. I placed one on the mantel. The firelight flickered against their faces. I thought of Lydia in a cell somewhere her designer world traded for concrete and silence. Maybe she'd finally understand what my father meant by patience. Maybe not. But her story wasn't mine to finish anymore. I poured myself a glass of wine and whispered into the quiet. "We did it, Dad. The house is safe." Outside, snow covered the walkway like a clean sheet over old blueprints. The air hummed with the kind of stillness that comes after justice, the kind that doesn't shout but settles permanent as stone. Spring came early that year. The first magnolia blossoms opened beside the porch, just as they had when my mother was alive, and the house no longer felt like a monument to grief, but a living thing breathing again. I spent weeks restoring the workshop, sweeping away years of dust, uncovering my father's tools, oiling the wooden bench until it gleamed like it once had under his hands. Every sound in that space, the scrape of sandpaper, the creak of the stool, the soft rhythm of rain against the roof, was a memory resurfaced. The quiet wasn't loneliness anymore. It was peace, earned the hard way. I'd hired a team from the firm to help with the renovation, but I insisted on repairing the entry door myself. It had been my father's first project after my mother's funeral and his last before Lydia's arrival. When I ran my fingers along the grain, I could still feel his presence, steady, patient, exacting. I replaced the cracked glass pane, restored the brass handle, and mounted a small plaque above the frame that read Thomas and Claire Matthews, built to last. The company thrived faster than I'd dared to hope. Within 6 months, we'd signed 2 new commercial contracts and expanded into sustainable design, a dream my father once sketched in his notebooks but never lived to see. Clients didn't just come for blueprints. They came for the story, the daughter who rebuilt her father's legacy from ashes without breaking her principles. Harlan called it poetic justice. I called it closure. The local paper ran a feature titled Patience and Power, the Matthews Legacy Restored. The article ended with a line that made me smile every time I read it, justice like architecture requires foundation and time. My father would have loved that. But justice also carries echoes, and not all of them fade quietly. One evening, I received a letter in handwriting I recognized instantly Lydia's. The return address read Federal Correctional Facility, Greenville. I almost threw it away, but curiosity won. Claire. It began, you were right. I destroyed everything I touched because I thought control was the same as love. Your father saw through me sooner than I realized, and in some strange way, I think he planned this reckoning to save us both from ourselves. I won't ask for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I needed you to know that I'm learning. I've started teaching literacy classes here. Turns out I'm better at helping others build something than pretending to own it. Maybe that's what Thomas saw in you, someone who builds. I read it twice, then set it aside. I didn't feel pity. I felt closure, the kind that doesn't need words to finish. A month later, I received another letter, this one from Gregory. He'd been released early on good behavior and was working construction upstate. His handwriting was shaky but honest. "You don't owe me anything," he wrote, "but I wanted to thank you. If you hadn't pushed back that day, I'd probably be dead by now. I don't expect to make things right, but I'm trying." That was the moment I realized the real inheritance my father left wasn't the house or the business, it was the blueprint for endurance. He'd taught me that justice wasn't about destruction. It was about structure, accountability, integrity, and rebuilding in a way that holds. On the anniversary of his death, I stood by his grave beneath the oak tree at the back of the property. I brought fresh magnolias, placed them against the headstone, and whispered, "You were right about everything, Dad. Patience isn't weakness, it's design." The wind picked up just then, scattering petals across the grass like quiet applause. When I walked back to the house, the porch light flickered on automatically, the same one my father had wired decades ago. For the first time, I smiled instead of crying. The legacy was no longer a burden, it was a framework. Before turning in, I opened the door to the study one last time, ran my hand over the walnut box on the shelf, and said softly, "The quiet ones really do change the world." And this time, the silence felt like an answer.